Okay, so I was not audible. So now I have just made it audible. Yes. Thank you, sir, for noting it. So the topic we are taking up is English in India, History, Evolution and Features. This is the fourth lecture of the lecture series which we are having on this particular topic. Before this, I have already taken up lecture series on the topic literary theory and a series on literary criticism. So some students wanted to connect with me and they couldn't find the lecture series. So all these lecture series are conducted by BARTI and it's available in the channel BARTI Online, wherein you can search with my name for the live lectures which are posted there. There was another query which was regarding connecting with me. So for that, you have got my contact number using which you can contact me. There is also the Gmail ID of Krishna's Canvas, which is my channel, YouTube channel for audiobooks, wherein you can use this to connect with me, to write to me. And yes, you can directly connect with me on my number. And all the lectures which are happening, they are live lectures and then they are available on BARTI Online, the channel, right? Now, we will be moving on to lecture 4, which we are going to take up today on this topic, English in India. We have already discussed about the history of English, how it got into the context of, literature, language, and pedagogy and academics in India, and what are its socio-political kind of implications. What are the different reasons for which this happened? So we have already discussed the history. Now we have we have discussed some of the important Indian English works, wherein we are taking up important works from different genres, be it novel, be it drama, be it short stories. So these different genres are visited, and what is our purpose? We are trying to see how the trajectory of English is defined by the use of kind of use of, or you can say by the projection of Indian stories or Indian mythos or Indian ideas in English language. Some of the texts which we have taken up is in translation. Some of them are originally written in English. So the next text we are going to discuss is An Astrologer's Day by R.K. Narayan. So it's a short fiction by Narayan. So in an unnamed village in India, an astrologer lays out his tools of the trade, a mix of cowrie, shells, obscure charts, a notebook and other such kind of things. So they serve no purpose but to create the illusion of mysticism. So they are kind of creating the illusion of what? Of mysticism. The astrologer has also painted his forehead with what? With sacred ash, wrapped his head in a turban, and seated himself and his gear beneath a large tree. All of these things serve to give him an air of wisdom, transcendence, and prophetic power. Though the narrator is quick to point out that none of these qualities actually belong to man. So you will see that you go to any of the astrologers anywhere, you will nowadays, though some of them are modern, but if you talk about the traditional attire and the traditional sense of presentation of somebody who is a prophet, somebody who is an astrologer, then you see that they have their own way of having a turban, putting sacred ash on the forehead, and then standing or sitting within a large tree. Now you have to remember that this is written by Narayan, projecting things which he has seen around him. So the realities, the stories which he is putting up is actually the reality and story of how he has seen these different people. So the astrologer what has the astrologer done? The astrologer has set up his little shop amidst a busy marketplace among people fencing stolen goods, presenting the same cheap food as a variety of gourmet delicacies and auctioning of low quality fabrics. The astrologer, quickly established as a fraud, is in the company of other fraudsters and spin doctors, that is, who are skilled in public relations, saying good things and creating good impressions. That is what they can do very well. Selling their wares and making their villages, or rather, you can see them in the villages and the cities in different places and making their living. So this is their way of living. So earning money. So the marketplace is lit by various shop lights and flares, the dancing shadows of which enhance the astrologer's mystical quality. He notably has no light of his own, but simply borrows that of the other vendors. So he doesn't have any light of his own, but he is borrowing that of the other vendors, other people who are there to sell different products. Now, as the marketplace is emptying and the lights are being put out, a stranger named Guru Nayak appears. In the darkness, neither can see much of other's face. Seeing the opportunity for one more client, the astrologer invites Guru Nayak to sit and chat. So we see two characters, prominent characters here, the astrologer and Guru Nayak, and they have sat together to chat, that is, to discuss certain things. The stranger does so, but is instantly skeptical of the astrologer. He aggressively wagers that the astrologer cannot tell him anything true or worthwhile. They haggle over the price and the astrologer agrees. However, when Guru Nayak lights a cheroot, the astrologer catches a brief glimpse of the man's face and is filled with fear. So, we see that it's really dark. Not many people are there. And, it's almost kind of empty street. And you cannot actually see anybody's face because of the darkness. And it is because he is lighting up his cheroot or like a cigar, you can catch a brief glimpse of the man's face. Now, if you have read the story After 20 Years by O. Henry, if you have not even read it, you can listen to it in my audiobook channel, that is Krishna's Canvas. You just need to type After 20 Years Krishna's Canvas in YouTube, you'll get it. Or visit my channel and just, listen to the audiobook. Then you will see that exactly same situation is created in that story, wherein Guru Nayak is lighting a cheroot and the astrologer catches a brief glimpse of the man's face. So there also, there were two friends, and when they were meeting after 20 years, it was very, very dark. And in the darkness, they could not see each other's face until one of his friends actually lights up a cigar. Similarly, here also a brief glimpse of the man's face is seen and it is filled with. He tries to get out of the wager, but Guru Nayak pulls him to it and will not leave him. So the astrologer arrives home late at night and shows his wife the money he has made, becoming briefly bitter when he realizes that although Guru Nayak has paid him a great sum, it is not quite as much as promised. Even so, his wife is thrilled as they lie down to sleep. The astrologer reveals to his wife that a great burden has been lifted off of his shoulders. Years ago, the astrologer was the one to stab Guru Nayak and leave him for dead. which forced him to flee his home and make a new life as a fraudulent astrologer. So he had thought himself to be a murderer, but was now content that he had not in fact taken a life. Satisfied by this, he goes to sleep. So he had thought that he had actually killed that person, but actually he has not killed that person. And seeing his face, he is happy and he goes off to sleep relaxed. The theme of the story focuses on single day in the life of an ordinary astrologer who suddenly faces past life in the present drastic situation. The story has a twist in the tale. The otherwise adventureless life of the astrologer suddenly poses a grave problem for his past life and demands alertness to tackle the situation. The story describes of a single day in the lives of the sleepy town of Malgudi. So if you remember, we discussed Malgudi days yesterday and how he has created this fictional place in South India, and it is projected in his story. So the characters in the story are no exception to these qualities of human nature. So human nature with its what? Its shrewdness, its revengeful nature and selfishness. The story are no exception to these qualities of human nature. Finally, all is well that ends well with the astrologer coming out with flying colors in the examination of befooling his opponent, saving his life, and also seeing it to it that he does not face the man again in future. Now we will just read little bit about Narayan, since we didn't talk about his biography yesterday during our discussion. So, Rasipuram Krishna Swami Narayan was born in a prosperous middle class family on October 10, 1906 in Madras, India. There he spent his early years with his grandmother and uncle. Later, he joined his parents, brothers, and sisters in the family home in Mysore. So, where was his family home? It was in Mysore. Mysore is probably the basis of his fictional city, Malgudi. So you can see that there are similarities between Mysore and Malgudi, which you can kind of find out when you read the stories which are there in Malgudi days. So an Indian city as complex and as real as William Faulkner's Hyokna Patwa County. So although according to his memoirs, he was never particularly enthusiastic about academic work, Narayan attended a Lutheran mission school and Christian college high school, both in Madras, and in 1930 received his BA from Maharaja's College, later the University of Mysore. He married in 1933 his wife Rajam, gave birth to their only child, a daughter named Hema, in 1938. Rajam died of typhoid in 1939 and Narayan never remarried. Now we are moving on to the next writer, which is his next work. So the next writer is Salman Rushdie. So lately a lot has happened. A lot of news has been there related to Salman Rushdie, what happened to his eye and how he had to face it, the kind of hostilities which he has been witness to. So he is again a very prolific writer who has a very special significance in creating providing English or Indian stories an English outlet. So his way of using Indian words in his English, the idea of chutnification, the idea of intermingling Indian language with English. So all these things you will get when you read Salman Rushdie's novels. They are really, really good reads. So, East West is a short story. This short story questions the supposed superiority of the West over the East. Living in England doesn't necessarily mean liberation from constricting traditions. So, living in England doesn't mean liberation from constricting conditions. So joining her fiancé in England would relegate Miss Rihanna to an inferior position. Rushdie subverts our preconceptions of the West as free and liberal, and the East as conservative and conservative. So he is kind of giving us a different worldview. Since we are seeing both the worlds, he is giving us a different worldview about the different paths. So Rushdie subverts our preconceptions of the West. The preconception is that we think that West is free and liberal, and that East is conservative and constricting. But Rushdie achieves this effect by narrating the story from Muhammad Ali's point of view. The old crook assumes that everyone dreams of going to England. So this is what his story East and West talks about. Next, there is another story which is Good Advice is Rarer Than Rubies by Salman Rushdie. So he says that good advice is rarer than rubies. It's a short story in the genre of post-colonial fiction. Why post-colonial? If you remember, when we have discussed the trajectory of English in India, then whatever is written in English in India after India gained independence is termed as the post-colonial literature or post-colonial times. We have discussed post-colonial theory when we have done literary theory as well. First published in 1987 in an anthology titled East West, it follows a woman who yearns, that is, who wants or longs to or wishes to travel to England to live with her fiancé. Most of the story takes place at the Indian British consulate. Highly dialogic, the story deals with the difficulties of the migrant subject and the distinct intersectional subjectivities. So the subject position of a diasporic character is really shaky. It's really difficult to define, because it is victim to what intersectional subjectivities. So the difficulties of the migrant subject is referring to an individual who has traveled from one country to another, and as a result has a distinct intersectional in the sense the original characteristics of his personality are already there, or subjectivity is already there, and then along with that comes the influence of the new country in which he is or she is living. As a result, this identity is kind of colored by an intersecting field which highlights, or which actually kind of projects the kind of dual existence or an intermingled situation and intersectional subjectivity, which arises or emerges from different marginalized narratives. The narratives which do not find a center stage, which are marginalized from the main narrative. So the title is a reference to the classical film The Wizard of Oz, in which ruby slippers allow its protagonist Dorothy to travel home. So this is the reference of the title. List of characters. Miss Rihanna applies for a visa at the British consulate to go to Britain. Muhammad Ali, a crook who swindles vulnerable women applying for a visa. Mustafa, the Miss Rihanna's fiancé who never physically appears in the story. So the meaning of the title. The word rubies situates the story in the East, which is the collective Western imagination full of exotic riches. So as per the Western imagination, we think the East as to be full of what? Of exotic riches, of pearls, of emeralds, of gold. This is what they imagine. So the title indicates the central irony in the story. Muhammad Ali, who normally scams gullible women, this time offers what he thinks is genuinely good advice, but because his assumptions about Miss Rihanna wanting to join her fiancé in England are false, the good advice isn't that good after all. So it's about the advice, it's about the character, it's about the riches, it's about the perception of East by the Western imagination. Next comes the writer Jhumpa Lahiri. You must have heard about her and have read her works. And the most important contribution, or rather the book which made her very famous, is The Interpreter of Maladies. However, after that, there are series of books which she has written. So you can take a note of them, how many books are there, what are their title, what is the context, what are the main characters. So you can kind of refer to them as well. So, Interpreter of Maladies, I don't know if you had this in your syllabus. Because if you have it in the syllabus, then you can actually read it. Otherwise, there is the story Interpreter of Maladies inside this collection of stories. So, Interpreter of Maladies is a book collection of what? Of 9 short stories by American author of Indian origin Jhumpa Lahiri, published in 1999. So, it won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and Hemingway Foundation Pen Award in the year 2000 and has sold over 50 million copies worldwide. It was also chosen as the New Yorker's best debut of the year and is on Oprah Winfrey's top 10 book list. So Oprah Winfrey is one of the celebrity talk show hosts, and she, in her list of top 10 books, this book finds a place. So the stories are about the lives of Indians and Indian Americans who are caught between their route and the new world. So he talks about the lives of the Indians and Indian Americans who are caught between their roots and the new world. So, Mr. and Mrs. Das, Indian Americans visiting the country of, so this is basically the story Interpreter of Maladies, which is there in this book named Interpreter of Maladies. So, Mr. and Mrs. Das, Indian Americans visiting the country of their heritage, hired a middle-aged tour guide named Mr. Kapasi as their driver for the day as the tour. Mr. Kapasi notes the parents' immaturity. Mr. and Mrs. Das look and act young to the point of childishness, go by their first names when talking to their children, Ronnie, Bobby, and Tina, and seem selfishly indifferent to the kids. Means they were not much bothered, not much caring about the kids. So the Indian parents, the way they take care of their kids, and the kind of time which they give, the patience which they give, it is difficult to find any such dedication. So a cultural shock is here, wherein it might be very normal for Mr. Das and Mrs. Das, but for Mr. Kapasi, it seemed really strange that there was selfishly indifferent attitude towards the kids. On their trip, when her husband and children get out of the car to sightsee, Mrs. Das sits in the car. So Mrs. Das is here for traveling, but even then she is not at all interested in going out of the car and seeing. Eating snacks, she offers to no one else, wearing her sunglasses as a barrier. So barrier to her sight and barrier for perception of other people as well, and painting her nails. So she is busy painting her nails, sitting in the car. And when Tina asks her to paint her nails as well, Mrs. Das just turns away and rebuffs her problem. Mr. and Mrs. Das asks the good-natured Mr. Kapasi about his job as a tour guide, and he tells them about his weekday job as an entrepreneur in a doctor's office. So it's just in normal, whenever you, for example, you have gone for traveling to a new place, you have traveled to a new place and you are kind of visiting that place and there is a driver who is helping you out in that place. You have hired somebody or somebody is actually taking you to some place. You see that you discuss things with that particular person, where he is from, what is he doing, which brings in more natural elements to the existence. So Mr. and Mrs. Das asked the good-natured Mr. Kapasi about his job as a tour guide. And he tells them about his weekday job as an interpreter in a doctor's office. So Mr. Kapasi's wife represents her husband's job because he works at the doctor's clinic that previously failed to cure their son of typhoid fever. She belittles his job and he too discounts the importance of his occupation as a waste of his linguistic skills. However, Mrs. Das deems it romantic and a big responsibility, pointing out that the health of the patients depends upon Mr. Kapasi's correct interpretation of their maladies. So you can see that it is from Mr. Kapasi's action of doing what? Of interpreting the maladies of the patients. So this is the point from which we have derived through which the writer derives the title of this particular story. So it is Mr. Kapasi's correct interpretation of their maladies or their problems, of their diseases, that it gives results to the idea of interpreter of maladies. Mr. Kapasi begins to develop a romantic interest in Mrs. Das and conducts a private conversation with her during the trip. So he is impressed by this beautiful lady, Mrs. Das, and he is conducting a private conversation with her. Mr. Kapasi imagines a future correspondence with Mrs. Das, picturing them building a relationship to translate the transcontinental gap between them. What is the transcontinental gap? This is the gap between two continents. The continent from which Mrs. Das has come and the continent where he is living. She explains that she chose to tell Mr. Kapasi because of his profession. She hopes he can interpret her feelings and make her feel better, as he does for his patients, translating without passing judgment. However, so what she is telling is of an affair which she once had, and that her son Bobby had been born out of her adultery. So this is the story which she is telling Mr. Kapasi. However, when Mr. Kapasi reveals his disappointment in her and points out her guilt, then Mrs. Das is not very happy. So you will see that if you are actually confiding in somebody, or rather you like to kind of open your heart to people who always are there with you. Even if you tell that you have done a mistake or something you have done, they're encouraging you. They're telling you, okay, it's fine, life is good, you can overcome this. So this kind of spirit, if somebody provides you, that is the kind of person you would like to divulge your secrets. Now, Mrs. Das actually thought that Mr. Kapasi would be of such kind of emotional strength. But we see that Mr. Kapasi is disappointed and points out her guilt, which makes Mrs. Das very angry, and she storms off, or that is moves away. So as Mrs. Das walks away towards her family, she leaves a trail of crumbs of puffed rice snacks, and monkeys begin to trail her. The neglectful Das parents don't notice as the monkeys following Mrs. Das's food trail surround their son Bobby, isolating the son born of a different father. The monkeys begin to attack Bobby, and Mr. Kapasi rushes in to save him. Mr. Kapasi returns Bobby to his parents and looks on as they clean up their son. So, there are certain layers to it which we need to discover how Jhumpa Lahiri actually creates the characters, their psychological belief system, their way in which they believe things, and the character of Mr. Kapasi and how Bobby being attacked and its idea is also significant. Next, we are going to refer to Chetan Bhagat, who's 5 point someone. So, 5 point someone is a novel by Chetan Bhagat. He's an Indian author. Many of his novels have been actually, transformed into movies in Bollywood. You must be knowing them. So, Bhagat is the author of 5 best-selling novels: 5 point someone, On Night at the Call Center, The 3 Mistakes of My Life, 2 States, and Revolution 2020, Love, Corruption, Ambition. So Chetan Bhagat's debut novel, 5 point someone, What Not to Do in IIT, or What Not to Do at IIT, that is Indian Institute of Technology, is one of the highest selling English novels published in India and remained on the bestseller list until now since its release in 2004. So you can understand how it has actually gripped the imagination of the young blood in India, and this reference is found everywhere. Novel begins in a unique way where the author takes the liberty of sharing his opinion that the book is not a guide on how to get into IIT, but it cites examples of how screwed up our college years can get if we don't think straight. So we have to remember it's about what not to do what not to do at IIT and not what to do at IIT. Although treated in a mild and rather casual way, the story of the IIT contains in it matters deeper than can be seen on the surface. That our structure of technical education has become a lifeless system and needs revitalization has been amply clear. The need for understanding the oft quoted phrase human resource development by our educators is pointed out, though obliquely suggested. But the real appeal of the work is probably its faithful depiction of growing years under the pressure of conventional ambition. The paper attempts, or rather, basically, this particular novel, you will see that there are various postmodernist thoughts in it. There is technical education, reference to that, and evaluating of the cognitive abilities of a student on the basis of CGPA. So all these things are referred to. But the main idea of it is that it is about the author, and we know Chetan Bhagat himself has studied in various, he has studied at IIT, he has studied at IIM, and his own youth, his own young life, what he did, what he did not do, that influenced him, that kind of created a knowledge base for him. So we discuss some of the important works with reference to their writers and their related good works which you need to study. Now we are going to discuss the phases based on which there was a development in English in India. So the first phase, if we have to talk about the development of English in India, it is missionaries. So the earliest attempts to introduce English in India were made by the missionaries who came primarily for the purpose of religious and moral preaching rather than for spreading English. Now, though the laudable goal with which the missionaries came to this subcontinent was the introduction of useful knowledge and of religious and moral improvement, these efforts can be seen as the first exposure that people in India had to the English people and their language. So, useful knowledge and of religious and moral improvement. And they have done it with the introduction of English. The missionary effort culminated in the setting up of Christian institutions in different parts of the Indian subcontinent. So we see some very, old and full of heritage institutes and schools which have started during the Britishers, or after, or somewhere near during that time, and are still going on, these missionary schools. The next phase would be the phase of Raja Ram Mohan Roy and T.B. Macaulay. So the second phase of the presence and spread of English in India is identified with two names, that is Raja Ram Mohan Roy and T.B. Macaulay. We have discussed in brief about them already. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy and T.B. Macaulay. Ram Mohan Roy led a group of Indians in demanding English education for the Indians. This group was convinced that English would be more useful for Indians than Indian language for academics, socioeconomic, scientific, and international purposes. So the efforts of this group considerably strengthened the hands of Lord Macaulay, whose famous minutes was passed in 1835. The clearly stated aim of the minute was to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions we govern, that is a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste and in opinion, in morals and in intellect. So this was the main intention of what was stated in the minute. Next comes what? Next comes 5 universities which were set up. Importance of these 5 universities in the trajectory of studying English in India. How or what did it contribute? So with the spread of English and the increase in the number of English-knowing Indians, the language came to be established as the official and academic language of India. By the end of the 19th century, 5 universities had been set up. That is Madras, Calcutta, Bombay, Allahabad, and Lahore. He also acquired great prestige and replaced Persian and the Indian languages in several areas of education, administration, trade, and business. So, we see that Persian was completely replaced by Indian languages in several areas of education, administration, trade, and business. Next, we are discussing significance of the 20th century, the context of English in India. So the 20th century witnessed further strengthening of the roots of English in India as an influential English press grew. As Kachru states, after World War I, there was a significant increase in educational institutions, and schools and colleges spread to the interior of India. So what happened after World War I? There was what? A significant increase in educational institutions, and schools and colleges also tried to spread to the interior of India. Today, if you go to a village, you will see there will be some of the other colleges nearby available, or in that village only available for, or in order to spread or disseminate knowledge. However, during that time, it was not the case. That is why the 20th century witnessed further strengthening of the roots of English in India as an influential press grew. As Kachuru states, after World War I, there was a significant increase in educational institutions and schools and colleges, which spread to what? To the interior of India, the places, villages, where the light of education had not reached. Slowly, it started reaching the interior of India. This actually helped in spreading bilingualism in India further among the middle and lower classes of Indian society. The period since then has been a tremendous increase in English knowing Indians. And even after the British finally left India in 1947, English continued to gain ground and become more and more firmly entrenched in the Indian soil. So it was like a seed which had already been put inside the soil. And as a result, slowly and slowly, it started getting strengthening, which is important. As a matter of fact, since independence, several committees and commissions have, on different occasions, stressed the need to learn English. So, different committees and commissions have stressed the need to learn English. Now, the government, on its part, has consistently lent support to English and encouraged the teaching and learning of English. So, the government is also contributing on its own part, has consistently lent support to English and encouraged the teaching and learning of English. Then comes our study of Indian English literature. So, the rise of the Indian writing in English is at the onset to be located historically. The first connection that we should be looking at is the introduction of the English language as a medium of instruction in India and the introduction of English literature as a subject in the universities. Now, before Indians could write poetry in English, two related preconditions had to be met. First, the English language had to be number one, what it is, that English language had to be sufficiently Indianized to be able to express the reality of the Indian situation. So if you have heard about pidgin English, if you have heard about chutnification of Indian language, Indian English, so the Indian English has different words in their original language because we could not find an appropriate word in the English language, since the socio-cultural reference and background of its origin is different for both the countries, and as a result, so you can actually refer to how the English has evolved. Secondly, Indians had to be sufficiently anglicized to use the English language to express themselves. In 1780, India's first newspaper, Hickey's Bengal Gazette, was published in English by James Augustus Hickey. And in 1817, the Hindu College, which later became Presidency College, the premier educational institution of Bengal, was founded. Now, Macaulay's Minutes. Yes. Hello, Mr. Gautam. Very good evening. And then the other person. I hope you can see this slide. So, Macaulay's Minute upon education or Indian education, introduced in 1833, provided for the introduction of English as a medium of instruction, with the claim that English tongue would be the most useful for our native subjects. India thus became a kind of testing ground for the launch of English literature, in the classroom at a time when English universities were still steeped in the Latin and Greek classics. Lord William Bentinck announced in 1835 that the government would so you can see it in the website regarding the notice. So you cannot see, is the screen not what to do at IIT. So I think if you can kind of see it in the landscape mode, it will help you. Then the Wood Dispatch of 1854 proclaimed that the establishment of universities as Bombay, Madras and Calcutta, and thereafter made the English language accessible to students, professors and also the officials of government. To begin with, the introduction of English at these levels had some interesting repercussions. That is, what are repercussions? Repercussions are the kind of, we can say the reaction of these actions. So what is pejoratively called Babu English, Babu culture, you can actually talk about and hear about it in the different stories which are written during that time, be it in English, be it in Hindi. So you can see their references. Became the first offspring of the unholy encounter between the British English language and the unwilling Babu. The first Indian novel in English was Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Rajmohan's Wife, which appeared in 1864. This novel was set in Bengal, a village in Bengal, and through a simple domestic story, it highlighted the central concern, that of the virtue of renunciation over self-love. The period from 1850 to 1900 is the imitative phase, wherein the Indian poets and writers and romantic poets in the Indian garb, they were imitating the different other phases which were there. So the first phase of Indian poetry, I hope you can see this. This is quite big. You should be able to see this. We are saying that the PDF is not visible. You can see this. And Mr. Gautam, the net set examination, you can actually see it in the website and find out the exact date. So the first phase of Indian poetry was the period of literary renaissance in India. Derozier's poems, Kashi Prasad Ghosh's The Share or Minstrel and other poems, Michael Madhusudhan Datta's The Captive Lady, Manmohan Ghosh's love songs and elegies are a testimony to the creative upsurge occasioned by the romantic spirit kindled by the literary renaissance. Toru Dutt, alone among these romantic poets of the first phase, puts an emphasis on India and her heritage by putting into verse a large number of Indian legends. So I don't know if you have read the poems of Toru Dutt. So all these writers and poets whom we are referring to, you can actually refer to their works. So the romantic Toru Dutt is also a predecessor in respect to the use of the tree in verse as demonstrated by our Casuarina tree. So this is a very famous poem. I'm sure all of you, since you are preparing for the net set examination in English, you must have referred to this particular poem. So we discussed some of the important poets of the first phase who were there during the first phase, which was the imitative phase. And then we are moving on to the poets of the second phase. The poets of the second phase, still romantic in spirit, were Sarojini Naidu, Tagore, Aurobindo Ghosh, and Harindranath, or Chattopadhyay. So from that surname, you can understand that Ghosh, Tagore, Chattopadhyay, they are all Bengali poets. The poetic output of these poets was prolific. Romanticism of these Indian poets was fraught with what? With nationalism because poetry had a very specific purpose to serve during that time, and it was about nationalism, about spirituality and mysticism. It was therefore different from English Romanticism. Indian Romanticism widened the poet's vision. While Aurobindo's was the search for the divine in man, Tagore's was the quest for the beautiful in man. So, for the poet Aurobindo, it was the search for the divine, divinity, God in man. For Tagore was the quest for the beauty or beautiful essence in man and in nature. So, this is what Tagore wanted to find out. Both were philosophers or poets as philosophers, and Sarojini Naidu's romantic muse underscored the charm and splendor of traditional Indian life and Indian scene. So, the next we are talking about Sarojini Naidu. She had a fine ear for verbal melody, as she was influenced not only by English poetry but also by the Persian and Urdu poetry. Next is Ramesh Chandra Dutt. The beginning of the 20th century saw a gradual growth of the novel form in English in India. So Ramesh Chandra Dutt was an important figure writing at that time. He occupied important government posts, and before retiring, he translated into English The Lake of Palms and The Slave Girl of Agra. Both these novels were published in London and were hailed as writings with dense plots and vivid characterization. Some other writers of this era include T. Ramakrishna, who wrote Die for Death, and Swarna Ghoshal, who wrote The Fatal Garland. Krupabai Satyananda wrote Kamala, A Story of Hindu Life. Bal Krishna, The Love of Kusuma. Sir Joginder Singh Nasrin, Raja Iyer, Vasudev Shastri, and a Madhavan in Thillai Govindan. So these are all historically valuable as links in this chain that was fast becoming the body of Indian writing in English, and various writers were contributing to this. The important writer here is Rabindranath Tagore. You cannot skip him when we are talking about English in India. So, it would be enough to appropriate him as a writer of English because he wrote with equal felicity and grace in Bengali. But it is also interesting that he has actually translated his own works into English as well. So, as a matter of fact, he was not known as a writer alone, but as an equally accomplished poet, playwright, and painter. So, he was a poet, a playwright, and also a painter. So, he was definitely creative. Creativity exuded from him. So, he was above all a visionary, a man who conceived institutions like Vishwabharati and gave to the world an ingenious model of education. So, Tagore's conception of education and his idea of how the world should be is there in his poem, Where the Mind is Without Fear. So, if you have not referred to that poem, you should refer to that poem. It's a phenomenal poem. You can get the audiobook of the poem in my audiobook channel, which is YouTube channel, Krishna's Canvas, wherein I have actually recited the poem Where the Mind is Without Fear, which is based on Tagore's educational philosophy. Then there are, other works like The Home and the World, The Wreck, and Gora, which have been translated from Bengali to English. However, it is Gitanjali which made Tagore a world literary figure, fetching for him the highest honor. What is the highest honor? The Nobel Prize in Literature for the year 1913, and more importantly, is considered as a significant ground that provided a spiritual interface between East and West. Written in 1913, it elevated Tagore to literal or literary immortality. So you cannot escape, you cannot kind of miss out on Tagore. You need to refer to him. Then three of the most important writers whom we have also discussed But talking about them together, this is how we can say that the following years saw many a story of success in the field of Indian writing in English. William Walsh, the English critic, picked out three of the most famous writers of literary circuit at that time. Number one is Mulk Raj Anand. Number two is R.K. Narayan, and number three is Raja Rao. Who became the trinity of Indian writing in English. Speaking of the big three, Walsh said, it is these three writers who defined the area in which the Indian novel was to operate. So what did it do? It is these three writers who defined the area in which the Indian novel was to operate. They established its assumptions, they sketched its main themes, freed the first models of its characters, and elaborated its particular logic. So each of them as an easy, natural idiom which was unaffected by the opacity of a British inheritance. So their language has been freed of the foggy taste of Britain and transferred to a wholly new setting of brutal heat and brilliant light. So this is what is being said by Walsh regarding these three writers referred to as the three trinities. However, the three being early representatives of the use of English language in describing an Indian experience, a struggle characterized their attempts. So the sustained structure of the novel form too added to the arduous nature of representing Indian life in English. Moreover, the novel being essentially a Western form imposed certain limits and also subsequently modified the Indian experience. So Rao pointed out in the preface of Kanthapura that one has to convey in a language that is not one's own the spirit that is one's own, and that is what makes it very difficult. That in a language which is not your own, you have to talk about things which are your own. So Indian ethos and Indian language or Indian emotion has to be expressed in a language which doesn't have Indian origin. So finding exact words, finding exact expressions is difficult. Then a discussion on Mulk Raj Anand. So Mulk Raj Anand started his career with the novel Untouchable. It was a unique work because the convention of Indian works having the highborn and the privileged as central protagonist was broken down. So the custom of talking about or telling the tales of the kings and the queens, that is broken. Instead of that, we get a new space wherein we are talking about the untouchable, which in itself was a very big vision and kind of a very unique thing to do. So the hero, Bokha, is a low-caste sweeper boy, and the novel is a description of the experiences that he undergoes in one day and as they impinge on his consciousness. So the hero is Bokha. So Bokha is a low-caste sweeper boy, and hence from a caste which is not, seen with regard. So the structure of the novel draws extensively from James Joyce's Ulysses in the use of stream of consciousness technique. So I think all of you must have read James Joyce's Ulysses and how there is the use of the stream of consciousness technique. Apart from this Western influence, he was also a member of the famous Bloomsbury group of writers in London too. Another important quarter which affected his writings was the idea of socialistic society as propounded by Mahatma Gandhi. So as an influence of this, he has reflected the ethos in his writing. The solution to Indian casteism that was given in Untouchable was in accordance with Gandhi's idea of dignity for the lowborn. So just the way we saw that in other novels of this period, there was influence of Gandhiji and his philosophies, here also there is reference to Gandhiji's idea of dignity for the lowborn. And hence, It is trying to give a solution to Indian casteism in the lines of Gandhiji. His other novels, The Village, Across the Black Waters, and The Sword and the Sickle, are also works with a reformative agenda. Next, Narayan. So, unlike the flamboyant Anand with Western influence, was the unpretentious and unassuming R.K. Narayan, whose first book was Swami and Friends. So, when we were discussing Malgudi days, that time only I had referred to this book, which is Swami and Friends, and his creation of this fictional town of Malgudi. So he created the fictitious region of Malgudi, a small South Indian town, a blend of Oriental and pre-1914. The characters are the small-time residents of this town and go about their quotidian concerns. However, out of this daily humdrum emerge certain life-affirming, brilliant flashes that the writer captures for the reader. Except for his work Waiting for Mahatma, which features the Quit India movement of 1942, current political issues do not figure in this writing. Then The Dark Room is a story of Savitri married to a callous husband Ramani. The Guide was one of his most appreciated works. It tells the story of Raju the Guide and his love for Rosie, whom he first meets as a client's wife. So The Guide is also a very significant work which you can refer to. Next, Raja Rao has produced 4 novels and a collection of short stories till date. Kantapura, The Serpent and the Rope, The Cat and Shakespeare, Comrade Kirillov, The Cow of the Barricades short story collection, wherein Kantapura is the story of a South Indian town that is affected by the civil disobedience movement. What is interesting about the book, however, is the narrative technique used by Rao. In our detailed description of yesterday's sessions, we have tried to talk about the character and the ideas which are reflected in this particular novel. So the story is told through the voice of the old woman inhabitant of the village who uses the structure of traditional folk epic, the Puranas. The book fuses the spirit of traditional religious faith of the village with that of the nationalistic movement. Then it starts this whole structure or this study of what? Of the diasporic writings. So, diasporic writings is the setup or the writing of the writers who have left their motherland and they have gone to a new country, and then they are writing from the diaspora, from their existence as a diasporic writer. So, this is again a new segment which we are going to take up in tomorrow's session on Indian writers and English in India, right? So, if there are any questions on today's session, then you can let me know. If not, then we will call it a day. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining in. Have a very good evening. See you all next day for the next session on this particular topic, which is English in India. Thank you so much.